Bonjour.
Well, where are you going?
Oh, I thought I'd take a tennis lesson.
I see. I suppose you've had a look at the pro, and he's desperately handsome, and you've conceived a schoolgirl crush on him. All right, go ahead and make the most of it.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Francisco Weber, who is a co-founder and CEO of Cortical.io. Welcome to the show today.
Hello.
So you studied medicine and you were involved in medical data processing. And over the course of your career, you have shared in other outlets that you were frustrated by the limitations of the state-of-the-art statistical methods. Can you elaborate on some of those limitations?
Yeah, so the problem basically with statistical data analysis is that we typically apply it when we are not exactly sure what we are looking for, and when we don't really understand the system. We start by doing some measurements, of course, and then doing some statistics on the measurements. That's, I would say, what we have done in medical research for many decades already. That was typically the approach, because we started out not actually knowing how the human body and so on works. Just to give an example, for example, in pharmaceutics, a couple of decades ago, it was perfectly normal to say, okay, we need a new molecule as a remedy for some disease. And what people did is basically they sent botanists into the Amazonian wood, for example, coming back with thousands and thousands of samples. And then they made mass testing against many different diseases just to spot where would be something that can be useful. And moving on from that, as I say, more statistical approach, we ended up by actually understanding how most of the medicines work on a molecular level. And nowadays, it's not uncommon to have people sitting in front of computer systems, basically designing those molecules with the exact target on what needs to be done chemically to get the function you need. And so that's what I think would also be great, to make that sort of leap step in sectors, especially like mine, for example, in working with language. Yeah. So.
Well, I think that's a terrific example of just the labor-intensive nature of how it used to be, and using everything from computational biology to AI. You're now able to quickly identify the kinds of molecules that's going to have the right properties and functionalities, to your point. Now, you've also helped set up the information retrieval facility in the field of information retrieval. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more on how that eventually led to what you're doing today.
Yeah, so with my current co-founder, we started a prior company that was very much focused in analyzing patent data. That's basically how I entered the sort of large-scale text analytics, as it was called in the early 2000s. So that was not yet the time talking about AI. It was precisely information retrieval, for example, a central term there. And that's also where I basically learned sort of how the whole concept can be applied to actual data, because it's a big difference if you work with like academic collections to try and find out something, or if you work with real world data. And for that, patent information is absolutely one of the most complex. And our former company specialized, in fact, in helping large industries in tackling very specific problems. So finding out, for example, where in a piece of text there is a description of a molecule, for example, and stuff like that. And as these problems were, at least at the time with the available computing power and so on, were pretty complex problems, we very early decided to reach out to the best specialists we can get. And we were lucky enough basically to sort of find the international information retrieval community. And there were just a lot of research groups working on precisely those specific topics. And they were struggling basically to get their hands on some real data. And as we found out, the industry was looking for specialists. So the idea was basically to provide what at the time was a large-scale computing device from silicon graphics with something like 90 processors or so. I mean, today that sounds funny, but in 2005 or 6, that was quite something. And what we did is we said, okay, we would allow research groups to experiment on that platform. And we would then try to, as soon as we see what they do and how they do it, bring them together with people from industry and have them work together to actually solve those topics. And that approach was quite successful. Interestingly, many of these groups came from large and well-known universities, but all the computing power at those universities was typically eaten up by particle physicists and meteorologists, and the poor sort of small group of linguists or computer linguists or information retrieval researchers, they had a hard time to get that computing time. And so they were kind of eager to come to the platform to get some real data from the industry. And there were really dozens of interesting projects coming out. And apart from the company, we sort of started this more research-oriented non-for-profit part that was precisely handling all the infrastructure and finding out which are the interesting projects and things like that. And then that went on for a couple of years.
Well, it's fascinating as a precursor to the work that you're doing today, because you guys were addressing infrastructure and computational power and scalability, but you're also talking about unstructured data and the domain-specific types of content. Whether we're talking about patent content, and anybody that's browsed through patents, it's actually very cumbersome.
Yeah, it's confusing to say the least.
Challenging. And of course, it's domain and sector specific as well. So tell us about how you've taken those learnings and brought it to cortical.io.
So basically, one of my personal biggest learnings was that, and we were mostly working with statistical language models and the like, was interestingly that they work pretty well on one hand, but on the other hand, even if we tune and tweak for ages, we don't even come close to what you would expect sort of a human person to be able doing. And my impression was right from the beginning that this is not just we have to throw a little bit more memory or processing power to it, and one day we eventually arrive at that level, but it was rather clear that this approach, while working to some degree, will never actually make the step. And sort of fortunately or unfortunately, it turned out to be pretty true, because if you look at our development in the area of natural language understanding since then, we have become better, but the increase of quality sort of was paid off with just an exponential growth of infrastructure, of processing power, and so on. And probably today, there might be, I don't know, 5 or 6 companies on the planet with the ability and the necessary financial backing to actually create a state-of-the-art English language model. Yeah, I mean, it does, no question. I mean, the GPT-3 and the like, it's really impressive stuff that comes out there. But if you think that calculating the model once might cost you, I don't know, $20 million and something like 2 months worth of Amazon time, that's not the way how this is going to become a commodity in business, to use language understanding wherever you can to automate tasks. I mean, tasks that we find in the real world, so to say, is can you filter out all the emails where a customer complains of a damaged package when it arrived there? Yeah, I mean, sounds trivial, but doing this for maybe a couple of 100,000 emails a day can end up being pretty costly, because you need sort of strong computing power to actually run this. And so my approach is that we should rather try and go in the direction of high efficiency AI. That's sort of completely opposite of what we are experiencing today. Nobody really worries much about energy efficiency and things like that. Not only for just saving energy, but for being able in, for example, shrinking the whole complexity of the infrastructure to a degree that we can hope maybe one day to run part of it at the edge, where the actual action happens. On the other hand, on a sort of more global scale, if you take like the top 10 industries that we have on the planet, all of these industries currently are heading towards becoming greener, having a smaller carbon footprint and so on. And the only industry that literally goes in the complete opposite direction is the computing sphere, yeah, in general, if we take like everything for communication and information processing. And that might sound funny to some degree, but we are talking about something like 4 or 5% of our global energy consumption today, and of course much more in 10 years from now. So I think this should be a problem that should really be addressed more broadly, I think.
Yeah, I think you bring up some excellent points, and certainly within the machine learning communities, it's pretty much well recognized that, you know, just because you have the computational power and the cloud and all these, you know, capabilities, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing, because it is increasing the cost and energy consumption and CPU power, as well as the, you know, the API services, the Lambda.
Not to speak of the complexity that it brings into, yeah.
So really, you know, rather than trying to, you know, just increase the workhorse, it's really looking at it from a different approach, and specifically the approach that you guys are taking is called the semantic folding and leveraging neuroscience. Specifically, you know, when we looked into it, it's this notion of analogy as a core of cognition. That suggests that the brain makes sense of the world by identifying and applying analogies, and this effectively is really referring to semantic folding theory. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit further around that, and how that allows for us to do these things in a much more efficient and seamless fashion than the current approach. You may also like our quarterly Ask Your Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit askyourperkins.com/events.
Yeah, so basically, what I was lucky enough to cross the ways of Jeff Hawkins from Numenta. You might know him from his time at Palm Computing, where he did a lot of fascinating things. And since he left the computer business, let's say, he became a brain researcher by passion, as I would say. And he does something very interesting. He is trying to figure out the computational principle of the human neocortex. It's basically the part of the brain which we use to actively think. First of all, I found his approach very compelling because he tries to sort of synthesize principles out of huge stacks of research data that he gathers. And what he came up with is sort of a theory that has evolved since 2005 or so, since he published it for the first time. And it immediately struck me, I mean, based probably on my own natural science background, that it made a lot of sense. Yeah, so the whole thing was, of course, not complete, but it was a whole different way to look at processing information than I was used on the computer side. Yeah, so and what I basically did is I took the constraints of his theory. So I said, let's assume he's right with what he says, and things work somehow like this, more or less. That theory, like all theories, bring in a certain number of constraints, and I try to rather model those constraints. So a constraint is, for example, that data is always encoded in the same way, mostly binary, as we are talking of neurons, regardless of where the data comes from. So on the actual brain side, what it says is that your vision information is processed at the level of the neocortex in the very same way as your auditory information or your touch information and so on. They all appear to the neocortex in the same format. I would assume, as the brain is coincidentally also the reference implementation for language, that also language has to appear somewhere in the brain. If we hear the word cat, that word has to appear at some point at the neocortex, and it will be encoded in precisely that unique fashion how the neocortex encodes. And that happens to be what's called technically a sparse distributed representation. So what you have is basically a huge binary vector, and the tiny little fraction of that binary vector consists of ones and basically the rest of zeros. That's what the brain does. What I added to this is that I needed a way to encode this binary information while capturing the semantics of the system. And interestingly, if you sort of dig deeper on the biology side, what you will find out is that all the sensors that evolution has given us, sort of our retina, our cochlea to hear, and all the sensory nerve endings in the skin and so on, they are all arranged, first of all, consisting of a large number of tiny subsensors. And those subsensors are arranged in a specific geometry. And what it turns out is that geometry is a very elegant form in capturing the relationship of things. And obviously our brain is optimized for doing so. And so from those constraints, to make a long story short, I came up with a machine learning way of encoding text into such a sparse distributed binary vector, but folding in a topology in the whole thing. And that topology basically stands for the geometry, how the data was sampled. And what you get basically is a machine, if you want, where you input text and you get out bitmaps that have a pattern that relates to the text. And what is special is that if you take two pieces of text that might talk about exactly the same thing while explicitly not using or sharing any word, they will still render in basically similar fingerprints. So what is interesting is once you have done that transformation into that fingerprint geometry, if you want, many highly complex systems, like, for example, disambiguating a word, finding out if a certain word is used in that sense or in that sense in a sentence, turns out to be not even a single processing step, but rather a side effect of processing the data in the background. And what we found, that was, I have to confess, it was not intentional. It turned out to be like this. Every semantic, under quotes, processing of that data, finding out the aboutness of the data, ended up being very cheap in terms of a handful of Boolean operators on those fingerprints. Yeah, and that is basically what our products today are based on. Is to use this in conjunction with more traditional learning algorithms. So we use all kinds of stuff from support vector machines to LSTMs, you name it, depending on what we want to do with it. But what we find out in the very end by doing that combination is that we use orders of magnitude less of training data, which correlates with what we experience as humans. I mean, even if we learn complicated tasks, we don't have to repeat them 300,000 times. We repeat them a bunch of times, and then we end up knowing. And that's something that's not possible with statistical modeling, because you need a lot of examples to end up with something reasonable. That phenomenon of sort of shrinking the amount of training data and making it sort of cheaper in creating training sets has big implications, specifically when you want to do business with that. Because suddenly you don't have to handle gigabytes or terabytes of text, and you have to find a specialist on the data and the specialist on processing and prepping the data and so on. But you can literally ask the end user of the system, who typically is a subject matter expert in whatever use case you model, and you can ask him, give me a bunch of examples, literally like 20, 50, something like that a human can actually conceive and produce. And based on that data, we end up doing tasks precisely like, for example, filtering out all the emails where a customer complains about the damaged packaging or whatever, regardless of what words are used, what language is used, and so on. And we can do this with a bunch of examples that sort of a clerk in the customer relation department created that model for themselves, and they can work with it. And that turned out to be sort of unleashing the trivial AI functionality, I would say, for general business in a sense. And yeah, so that's how we make progress, hopefully.
Well, I think this is a very exciting, and for those that are trying to kind of stay with you in terms of some of these sophistication, is that this is a pretty far departure from the status quo. And just for the listeners who are trying to kind of grasp this, again, we're talking about generally unstructured text. But however, for analogy purposes, I think the way humans, let's take a toddler, for example, they learn to open their bedroom door. And instead of having to, unlike typical machine learning, where, they're fed potentially millions of data points to open that bedroom door and recognize a bedroom door handle in particularly, that child, as he or she grows up, learns that this notion of opening can also be applied to a microwave, can be applied to a car door, and even to something that's kind of unusual, at least from a machine learning perspective, is that like a seatbelt, the notion of opening a seatbelt, which is fundamentally from a computer vision going to be very different from opening a door handle. It's this notion of these concepts that have similar, you call it fingerprints or bitmap, but it's this this geometry that you're talking about, where our brain is so sophisticated that we're able to take all these nuances, these micro sensors, but you're still able to synthesize in this fashion, this framework that you're referring to, and still come back to something that we can kind of recognize from a general concept. It's a really beautiful, elegant approach. And I wonder, and you start to kind of talk a little bit about it, but if you could elaborate on a few more case studies and applications of how others are using this, especially in a kind of a large scale fashion. Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Julianne Hough, actress, dancer, and winner of Dancing with the Stars; Damian Vaughn, former NFL player; Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
Yeah, so as soon as we had the first version of our technology usable, sort of, the first thing that blew us away was basically the fact that that can be applied to nearly everything. Yeah, so everything you can formulate into language, you can try that approach and solve it. And typically, if a human can solve it, which means there is enough semantics to actually find a solution to a challenge, then probably we find also a way doing this using our approach. So basically, we inversed the whole thing, and we basically saw that there were certain types of use cases coming more and more often. And maybe as a parenthesis, in the very beginning, we were doing sort of specific implementation for specific customers. That was still very much handcrafted. And those customers typically have tried to solve a problem for a long time, have spent a lot of money with bigger companies, well-known technologies, and have found out it's not possible to do that efficiently. And so there was also this case with this very large bank in New York. They have tried to extract certain information from their credit agreements that they have. And what they needed to do is to extract certain aspects of the credit agreements, and that would then be fed in some risk modeling system and so on. And it turned out that this is to do this in real life, in real production with 150,000 contracts is quite an endeavor. And they used to do this by just having service providers with like a couple of hundred attorneys doing this for them. And they have tried all the available technologies at the time. And we were able to show them first successful results within a couple of weeks. And from that, basically, we refined the whole procedure so that today we have a product that is systematically able to extract any kind of unstructured information from contracts, which is currently used a lot from banks and insurance companies for obvious reasons. I mean, their products, their whole transactions, everything is language on paper. So that has a very important role for them. And the second product that we also have launched recently is a system that's capable of ingesting messages from emails over tweets, over social media posts, and so on, and to actually classify them. So as I said in my example before, find me all the emails where a customer complains about something. You take a bunch of example emails and you can basically train in a couple of minutes a classifier that does this. And the third component is a search system. You can imagine this to be more or less like Elasticsearch. It's a search framework. The difference is it's not using literal words, but again, it's making fingerprints of whole documents or paragraphs in documents, and is then able to find similar documents or similar pieces of text in a collection that has been indexed. And with a combination of those three elements, it's astonishing. It's like sort of, if you know what addition, subtraction, and multiplication is, you can basically do all of the math that's out there, and it's a bit similar here. With those three elements, you can tackle anything from smartening your chatbot to risk managing your contracts, and all of that by creating and training models yourself, and not by what more often is the business model today with machine learning companies. In fact, you do not license so much the software, but you mostly license the model. And what we do is that we license the software, and the user creates their own model, and they own their model in the end, which is also, I think, from a business standpoint, quite an interesting change.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I think in quick summary is that, you know, when you take into account your contract intelligence tool, messaging intelligence, and then this Elasticsearch, to your point, you could pretty much handle legal contracts, patent search, academic papers and research, to any types of unstructured communication in whatever form and fashion. So it really starts to provide this massive means to efficiently call through what used to be very time-consuming and cost prohibitive, and you do it in a way that has high degree of accuracy. And again, it's quite interesting. But I think the fundamental thing that we're taking away is that it's very easy to keep adding computational power and storage and memory, but really asking the why and taking a different approach, and how that provides new forms of efficiency in ways that we can't even think of. My last question for you, and we're almost out of time, is to your point, you mentioned virtual assistants and chatbots and so forth. But one of the issues that I think we're going to hit pretty soon in terms of robotics, physical forms that are using some sort of NLP, NLU, is this ability to be able to actually really understand the nuances of a conversation and be able to intervene and respond in a way that contextually makes sense. So we're seeing robots inside a senior citizen's home, for example, that's not just reminding them of medication, but also lifestyle changes and reminders. So how could this play into a physical form and kind of the API services that we're seeing out there that provides these speech-to-text and text-to-speech capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, there has been massive progress has been made, I would say, in general, at this step of converting the analog world in a digital form. So rendering speech, for example, in a sequence of words. But still, you have to figure out what the word means. That's one thing. And the technology that we have today just needs too much power, especially if you want to use it in real time, because the robot situation has to be interactive in real time while doing lots of other things. Yeah. So that it literally becomes a problem of efficiency. I used to joke that Apple is in fact lucky that people are not using Siri as much as they could, let's say, because in the end, the iPhone is just a microphone. Yeah, the actual Siri action happens in the data center. So if like 1.5 billion customers would just for every little thing use Siri, would be quite expensive to keep that running. So I think that especially for that kind of interactive machine-human interface, conversational interface, is definitely something that needs to sort of become much more efficient. So to me, let's say in my head, that's a bit of a milestone. If we manage to get sort of a conversation to where the action is, then we have reached levels of efficiency that come close to human efficiency. I mean, don't forget, we do we write Nobel Prize awarded papers while using like 10 watts or something with our brain. Yeah, so we are really far away from that still. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. So with that, I've been joined by our friend Cisco Weber, who is the CEO of Cortical.io. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.